She was 34 years old. She drove a 1979 Ford Fairmont, the color of old rust, and she kept a rosary looped around the rearview mirror because her mother had given it to her the year she graduated from nursing school. On the morning of September 9th, 1985, she left her house on Birchwood Lane in Harlan County, Kentucky, at 6:40 in the morning for a grocery run she had promised her husband she would finish before noon. She never came home. That is not a story about a woman who walked away from her life. That is a story about a man who decided he was entitled to end it. A man who lived for the next 38 years inside the ordinary rhythms of a community that trusted him. A man who coached Little League and shook hands at church and attended the memorial vigils that Karen's family organized every September, year after year, as the case went cold and stayed cold and settled into the silence that swallows things in small towns when no one can prove what everyone suspects. It would take 38 years, a forensic laboratory in Frankfurt, and a single strand of hair recovered from a paper evidence bag that had sat in a storage room in the Harlan County Sheriff's Office since the autumn of 1985 to finally say his name out loud in a courtroom and make it stick. But before we get to that morning in the lab, we have to go back to Birchwood Lane, because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Karen Wells was and what she had built in that corner of eastern Kentucky before it was taken from her. Harlan County in the mid-1980s was a place that had already survived more than most places had been asked to endure. The coal mines had been the county's heartbeat for generations, and by 1985, that heartbeat was irregular. Layoffs and cutbacks, and the particular grief of a community watching its primary industry retreat. Men who had worked the same seam as their fathers stood in lines at the employment office. Families that had been rooted in the same county for 4 generations were beginning to consider leaving for the first time. There was a specific kind of dignity in how Harlan County people responded to that pressure. Quietly, without complaint, by looking after each other the way they always had. Karen Wells was a product of that ethos in every way. She had grown up 2 counties over in Leslie County, one of 5 children raised by a father who worked surface mining and a mother who ran the books for a small appliance repair shop on Main Street. Karen had been the child who organized things, the one who made sure the younger ones had their lunches packed, who stayed after school to help the teachers sort materials, who saved her babysitting money for 2 years to buy her mother a new winter coat. She had wanted to be a teacher, then changed her mind and became a licensed practical nurse when she was 22. And she was proud of that choice in the steady, unassuming way that people in Harlan County were proud of things, not by talking about it, but by showing up every single day. By 1985, she had worked at Harlan R Hospital for 8 years, on the maternity ward, which she had specifically requested and specifically loved. Her colleagues remembered her as the nurse who sang softly to the newborns when she thought no one could hear her. She had a daughter named Brianna who was 6 years old that September, with her mother's dark eyes and her habit of naming every bird that visited their backyard feeder. Karen and her husband Thomas had been married 9 years. They were saving for a bigger house, not ambitious saving, patient saving. The kind where you give up small things for years without resenting it because you can see clearly what you're building toward. She had a habit, her sister Lynette would say later, of turning back. If she drove away from the house and thought she'd left a burner on, she would turn back, even if she was already halfway to wherever she was going. She turned back a lot. She didn't like leaving things uncertain. On the evening of September 8th, 1985, Karen had called her mother to wish her a happy birthday and stayed on the phone for nearly an hour. She mentioned the grocery run she was planning for the next morning. She said the weather was turning and she wanted to make a big pot of soup that week. Her mother would replay that phone call for the rest of her life. The next morning, Karen Wells drove away from Birchwood Lane, and she did not turn back. The first person to understand that something was wrong was not a sheriff's deputy or a hospital colleague. It was Thomas Wells, who had expected Karen home by noon and, when she was not, called the grocery on Route 119 where she usually shopped. The clerk at the store that morning, a teenager named Bobby Chadwick, told Thomas that he had seen a woman matching Karen's description in the parking lot sometime around 8 a.m. She had been standing near her car, he thought. He had not seen her go inside. Thomas called the Harlan County Sheriff's Office at 12:45 p.m. He was told, as families were routinely told in 1985, that an adult missing for less than 24 hours was not yet a department priority. By 3:30 in the afternoon, Thomas had driven to the grocery himself. The Ford Fairmont with the rosary on the rearview mirror was still in the parking lot. The engine was cold. The driver's side door was unlocked. On the back seat, Karen's canvas grocery bag, the reusable kind she always brought because she disliked waste, was still folded, unused. She had never made it inside. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the lot at 4:15 p.m. and called in a vehicle examination. What they found was limited but significant. No signs of a struggle inside the car. The keys were not in the ignition and were never found. On the passenger floorboard, partially tucked under the seat, was a dark hair, a single strand, several inches long, that did not match Karen Wells's hair color. It was collected, bagged, and logged into evidence as Item 7 in the case inventory. Nobody understood what it would mean for 38 years. The following morning, a search of Route 119 and the surrounding roads turned up nothing. By the end of the week, 30 volunteers from the county had combed the creek beds in the hollow roads east of town. Nothing. Karen Wells had stepped out of her car in a grocery parking lot on a Tuesday morning and disappeared as completely as if the ground had opened and taken her. Her purse was gone. Her keys were gone. Item 7 sat in its paper bag in the evidence room. 3 weeks in, no leads, no body, no answer. The lead investigator assigned to the Karen Wells case in those first weeks was Detective Eugene Barr, a 16-year veteran of the Harlan County Sheriff's Office, who had worked almost every serious crime in the county during his tenure, and who approached the Wells case with a thoroughness that his record would suggest. Barr was a methodical man, the kind of detective who reread his own notes before bed, who kept index cards rather than legal pads because he liked being able to sort information physically, move it around, look at it differently. His wife would say later that he never stopped thinking about Karen Wells, not in any of the years that followed. He thought about her while he was mowing the lawn. He thought about her on Sunday mornings. In October and November of 1985, 2 men came under scrutiny. The first was a man named Roy Dunbar, a twice-divorced mechanic who had been involved in a public disturbance at a bar in Harlan 3 weeks before Karen's disappearance, and who had no verifiable alibi for the morning of September 9th. Barr interviewed Dunbar 4 times. The man was hostile and uncooperative, which Barr noted and took seriously, but hostility toward law enforcement in Harlan County in 1985 was not uncommon, and without physical evidence connecting Dunbar to the Wells car or to Karen herself, the investigation reached a wall. Dunbar was eventually eliminated when a waitress at a diner on Route 421 came forward 3 months later to confirm she had served him breakfast that Tuesday morning, an alibi he had declined to mention himself, apparently out of pure stubbornness. The second individual was a man Barr identified only by initials in his case notes. Court documents unsealed years later would confirm this was a man who had been Karen's neighbor briefly in 1982 before relocating to a county to the west. He had known Karen casually. Barr drove to speak with him personally and found him cooperative, present, and impossible to place at the scene. He was eliminated. Meanwhile, Thomas Wells had taken Brianna to stay with Karen's parents in Leslie County, and he had gone back to work because there was nothing else to do, and he didn't know how to be in that house alone. He called Eugene Barr every Tuesday morning. Every Tuesday morning, Barr told him what he honestly could. They were still working it. They had not given up. There was nothing new to report. Brianna turned 7 that October without her mother. Thomas bought her a cake from the grocery on Route 119, the same grocery. He had nowhere else to go. He couldn't stop going places Karen had been, as if she might have left something behind somewhere that he hadn't checked yet. By the spring of 1986, with no physical evidence beyond Item 7 and no witnesses who could place Karen with any specific individual, Detective Barr documented the case as inactive pending new information. It was the most honest thing he could have written, and it felt, he later said, like signing something he hadn't agreed to sign. 28 years. That was how long the Karen Wells case stayed in the inactive cabinet before a detective named Sandra Reeve pulled it back out. By 1995, a decade had passed. Brianna Wells was 16 and lived with her father in Harlan County, where Thomas had returned after a few years away and built a quieter life. Not a happy one, exactly, but a functioning one. She kept a photograph of her mother on her dresser. She had learned to cook from her grandmother, who made the same big pot of soup every autumn that Karen had described wanting to make in that last phone call, because there was no better way that woman knew to keep her daughter present in the world. Detective Barr retired from the sheriff's office in 1997. Before he left, he transferred the Karen Wells case file into a box that he took home himself, with the department's permission, because he was not prepared to leave it entirely. The box sat in his garage on a metal shelf beside his hunting gear. He opened it every few months. He read the same index cards. He looked at the same dead ends. He drove to the grocery lot once a year and stood in the parking space where the Fairmont had been found and tried, one more time, to see something he had missed. In 2001, the parking lot was resurfaced and expanded. A pharmacy was built where the adjacent lot had been. The geography of the last place Karen Wells had been seen was physically altered. Brianna Wells graduated from Eastern Kentucky University in 2001 with a degree in social work. Her father attended the graduation and stood in the auditorium holding a single photograph of Karen in a frame he had brought from home, because it seemed wrong to be there without her, and he didn't know a better way to include her. By 2010, 2.5 decades had passed. The Karen Wells case appeared in a local paper's retrospective on unsolved county cases and prompted a brief round of new calls to the sheriff's office, all dead ends. The department received a tip from a man in Ohio who claimed to have information, investigated it for 6 weeks, and found nothing. The evidence from the original case, including Item 7, the single hair in the paper bag, was still in storage. Nobody had tested it. In 1985, the technology did not exist to extract a DNA profile from a single strand of shed hair with sufficient reliability for court use. By 2010, that technology existed. The question was whether anyone was going to use it. Every case on this channel is built from weeks of research, cross-referencing records, and tracing lives that deserved more than they got. If you want us to keep telling stories like Karen's, take a second to like and subscribe. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. This community spans more countries than you'd imagine. Now let's get back to what finally changed everything. In the fall of 2023, Brianna Wells, now 44 years old, a licensed clinical social worker, the mother of 2 children who had never met their grandmother, submitted a written request to the Harlan County Sheriff's Office asking for a formal review of her mother's case in light of advances in forensic hair analysis. She was not the first family member to make this request. She was the third. The first two had been reviewed and deemed insufficient for new analysis based on the condition of the evidence. Detective Sandra Reeve, newly assigned to cold cases for the department, read Brianna's letter on a Wednesday afternoon in October 2023. She pulled the case file. She pulled the evidence log. She found item 7. She sent it to the Kentucky State Police Forensic Lab in Frankfort. The hair in the paper bag had been sitting in climate-controlled storage for 38 years. Forensic hair analysis has changed almost beyond recognition since 1985. What was possible in that era was limited to microscopic comparison, an examiner looking at one hair alongside another and offering an opinion about similarity, a method that courts have since moved substantially away from because of its documented unreliability. What is possible now is different. Mitochondrial DNA sequencing, the process of extracting genetic material from the shaft of a single human hair and building a DNA profile capable of comparison against databases and known reference samples, has made hair evidence, when properly preserved, a powerful investigative tool that the 1985 lab simply could not have accessed. The Kentucky State Police Lab completed their analysis of item 7 in January 2024. Detective Reeve was in her office on a Tuesday morning when the email arrived with the lab report attached. She opened it. Read the summary section. Read it again. Then she walked to her supervisor's office, knocked once, and set the report on his desk without saying anything. He read it. He looked up. "Do you know this name?" she said. He knew the name. Everyone in Harlan County knew the name. Walter Kress had lived in Harlan County his entire life. He was 71 years old in 2024. He had worked as a supervisor at a supply depot outside Harlan for most of his working life, retiring in 2012. He was a deacon at his church. He had coached youth baseball for 11 years in the 1980s and 1990s and was remembered by at least 2 generations of Harlan County kids as a steady, patient man who showed up early and stayed late and never raised his voice. He had attended several of the annual September vigils for Karen Wells. He had signed a sympathy card for Thomas Wells in the fall of 1985. His name did not appear in the original case file under suspects. It appeared once, in a peripheral canvass of individuals known to frequent the Route 119 commercial area, a list of roughly 60 names, none of whom had been individually investigated beyond basic confirmation of presence. Walter Kress had been on that list. Eugene Barr had noted no reason to pursue him further. What the mitochondrial DNA sequencing established was that the hair, recovered from the passenger floorboard of Karen Wells's Ford Fairmont, matched Walter Kress's mitochondrial profile at a statistical certainty that the Kentucky State Police Forensic Lab described in their report as consistent with originating from the same maternal lineage. A reference sample from Kress was obtained through a court order in February 2024 and submitted for full nuclear DNA comparison against biological material that forensic examiners, working with upgraded testing methods unavailable in 1985, were able to recover from a second location in the original evidence, a detail that court documents would later describe as trace material recovered from the driver's side door interior. The full nuclear DNA comparison came back in March 2024. Walter Kress was arrested at his home on the morning of April 3, 2024. Harlan County Sheriff's deputies and Kentucky State Police officers arrived at 7:15 a.m. He came to the door in work clothes. He looked at the officers assembled on his front porch, and he did not look surprised. His neighbor, a woman who had lived next door for 22 years, watched from her window, and said afterward that she stood there for a very long time before she was able to move. Kress was charged with the murder of Karen Louise Wells in the first degree. He was held without bond. In the community where he had coached baseball and served as a deacon and shaken hands at the September vigils, the news traveled the way news travels in small counties. By phone, by word of mouth, by people sitting in parked cars calling each other to confirm what they had just heard. The high school where Brianna Wells had grown up was one of the first places the news reached. A teacher there who had known Brianna's family for decades sat in her car in the school parking lot and cried for a long time before she went inside. Walter Kress entered a guilty plea in November 2024. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He made no statement at sentencing. He looked at his hands throughout the proceeding. Brianna Wells sat in the front row of the courtroom that day with her father, Thomas, who was 73 years old and had waited 39 years for a day that he had sometimes believed, in the darkest of the cold years, would never come. When the judge read the sentence, Thomas Wells closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long moment. Then, he opened them. Karen Wells was 34 years old. She kept a rosary on her rearview mirror because her mother gave it to her, and she drove back home when she thought she'd left a burner on, and she sang softly to newborns on the maternity ward when she thought no one could hear. She had a 6-year-old daughter with dark eyes who named every bird that came to the backyard feeder. She had a pot of soup she was planning to make that week. She had a future that was entirely, completely hers, and it was taken from her in a parking lot on a Tuesday morning in September 1985 by a man who then lived 38 more years inside the trust of a community that deserved better than to have given it to him. Her daughter issued a statement after the sentencing. It was brief. She thanked Detective Sandra Reeve and the Kentucky State Police Forensic Lab and Detective Eugene Barr, who had died in 2019 at the age of 77, still believing the case would eventually close. She said her mother was a nurse who sang to babies. She said she had named her own daughter Karen. She said that the truth had taken 38 years to arrive, and that she had spent much of that time not knowing how to hold both the grief and the waiting at the same time, and that now she thought she understood. You hold the waiting, because the truth is worth it, however long it takes. A single strand of hair, preserved in a paper bag, waiting for the science to catch up to the crime. How many other evidence rooms in how many other counties hold items just like it? Collected with careful hands in the weeks after a disappearance, logged and stored and forgotten, waiting for a detective like Sandra Reeve to pull a file and ask a question that nobody had thought to ask in decades. What does it mean that Walter Kress attended those September vigils, stood in the candlelight beside the people who loved Karen Wells, and said nothing for 38 years? And do you believe that a sentence of life without parole, handed down at the age of 71, is justice? Or is justice something that requires arriving in time to matter? Leave your answers below. This community wrestles with these questions seriously, and we read every comment. Justice found Karen Wells after 38 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, because the truth does not have an expiration date, and neither does the obligation to find it. If you believe that too, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.